Graw. Goldilocks Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. Berehaven would be a much pleasanter place if it weren't for her family, Ursula thought as she tossed and turned in her bed, unable to sleep. She kept thinking she heard the scratch of mice again. Had she missed one? Probably. Her brothers had kept them in the chest containing her best clothes, knowing it was the most secure place to breed mice, far from the prying eyes of their nurse. Especially as there would be no feast days until midwinter. Of course the boys hadn't considered that Ursula was a woman now, old enough to be betrothed and married, and the presence of Lord Vauquelin's envoy in the castle meant she would have to present herself in her best gowns, night after night, until the feasting and negotiations for her wedding to whoever father decided she would marry were concluded. Never mind that she'd never met her prospective husband, or that she never wanted to leave the shelter of Berehaven. The Bear River came down from the mountains pure and clear as the ice that fed it, carving their valley and the fertile fields into a slice of heaven nestled up against the mountains. But she was a dutiful daughter, however grudgingly, and Ursula had sought a new gown to air for tomorrow night, only to discover the hems of every single one chewed to ribbons. Further investigation had revealed a chess set that she knew belonged to her brothers, but inside it there were no chessmen to be seen. Just a mouse and her litter of pink newborns, in a nest of strips torn off her dresses. As a good lady should, she took the problem to the source. Her brother's chamber was off the passage below her tower, and she'd laid the chess set and a destroyed gown on Giddy's bed before demanding an explanation. Giddy had just stared at the items on his bed in horror, so it was Eudes who had told her the story, claiming it as his idea. The boys had wanted to breed mice to bait a trap for the golden eagle who lived in the crags upon the mountain. If they could catch the eagle, they could train it to hunt for them, bringing in fresh meat all winter once the ice had closed the passes and isolated the valley until spring. She might have lost her temper at that point. Perhaps a little. And her voice may have been a little louder than it should have been, telling them how foolish their idea truly was. Loud enough so that father had heard, and Baron Orson had not been pleased to find his two youngest sons squeaking on the floor, transformed into terrified mice, while his only daughter stood over them with her arms folded, insisting they apologize before she'd change them back into boys again. At father's insistence, she changed the boys back, expecting to see them punished properly. Instead, her father had then seized her arm and escorted her back to her own rooms at the top of the maiden's tower, before unleashing a torrent of words that echoed in her head even now, hours after he'd uttered them. "That is the last time I ever want to see you practice magic," he'd said. "Do you know who is in this castle at this very moment? An envoy from Lord Vauquelin himself, asking for your hand. A marriage alliance with one of his sons would ensure peace with our neighbors for a generation, so that when it is my time, your brother Geoffrey will not have to worry about attacks from anywhere, for Vauquelin is the power in these parts. He is asking for an enormous dowry, oaths of allegiance, all manner of things, for allowing you the honor of marrying into Vauquelin's family. I have told him you will be a perfect wife, meek and obedient in all things, but if he has heard any of this, he may leave tonight and find another, more suitable bride for his lord's son. Instead of peace, we will have war, for without an alliance, Vauquelin will conquer us before King Siward can come to our aid. We are a small barony, but we have been loyal to King Almos even when we had no contact with him through the wall, and after 50 years, our loyalty is about to be rewarded by his successor. King Siward has promised all trade shall pass through our valley just as it once did, but only if we can protect the trade route. If this alliance fails, we will be forced to fight, and many of our people will die to defend what is ours. And their blood will be on your hands." Ill though it had sat with her, Ursula had vowed to do no more magic, ever, if it would place Berehaven in danger. She'd have to marry someone eventually, and at least one of Lord Vauquelin's sons could afford to buy her nice gowns. He'd be a man, and, like all men, her father and brothers included, he'd care only for war and honor and position and occasionally hunting. Violence and status. She wouldn't be expected to see him more than a few times a year, as he went off to lead armies or hunt bears or whatever it was men filled their days with to make themselves feel important. So it was best that she choose a husband who would help her protect what she loved most, Beerhaven. Even if her marriage meant banishment from Beerhaven forever. But if something were to happen to her brothers, turned into mice perhaps, she would inherit Beerhaven one day. She was father's firstborn after all. Before Eudes, Giddy or even Geoffrey, it had been just Ursula and her mother and father, and they'd shared this tower room when her grandfather was alive. Father's and mother's chairs still sat by the wall, beside the tiny stool she'd once sat upon to listen to her mother's stories. Oh, stories where princesses married for love, or defeated monsters, and lived happily ever after. Ursula smiled into the dark at the fantasy, but it didn't last long. She might not like her brothers, or even her father much at the moment, but her father and then Geoffrey would do what was best for Beerhaven. And so would she, even if it broke her heart to leave. If only the world were different, and it didn't have to be that way. Where the eldest daughter might inherit as readily as a son, and a woman could choose her own fate, and her own home. She might as well wish for the ability to fly, like the eagle that had inspired her brothers to destroy her best dresses. What a world that would be! Another scraping sound jerked her out of her reverie. It sounded too big to be a mouse. A rat, maybe. Or a cat trying to catch the mice. Ursula settled deeper under her blankets, waiting for the panicked squeaking, then silence as the cat claimed its victory. 2. So, does everyone understand their role in this attack? Lord Vauquelin asked. He waited for the other men to nod before he continued, Good. Be swift and silent, leave no survivors, and Beerhaven will be ours by dawn. Ready your men. In an hour, we march. Father's knights trooped out, leaving Bernard alone with him. Did you not hear me? I said get ready. Father waved his hand in dismissal. I still don't know what my role in all this is, Bernard began. As his father's brows descended, Bernard felt the childish urge to hide under the table from the blow he knew would be coming next. Childhood habits die hard. I'm sorry, Father. I've never been in a battle before. The king. The king is no longer your concern, Lord Vauquelin snapped. He no longer wants you at court, and so you are no use to me there either. So make yourself useful. Every man in my army is a skilled swordsman, and as a member of the king's court, you must have had plenty of training. In fact, I have the perfect task for a man of your talents. When Father grinned like that, Bernard often thought he looked like a wild beast about to devour his dinner alive. Bernard shivered. I am your obedient son, Father. Anything you command, if it is within my power to deliver it, then I shall. Father grinned even more widely. Your job is to make sure there is no one left alive in the Maiden's Tower when the sun rises. I'm sure you are man enough to defeat Baron Orson's defenseless daughters. Bernard closed his eyes. In his imagination he could already hear the girls' screams. But if the girls must die, better that they die on his sword than that of some of Father's common soldiers. Anyone else would keep the girls alive as long as possible and not kill them before dawn. He'd seen firsthand what soldiers could do. At least he would leave them their virtue if not their lives. Bernard bowed his head. Of course, Father. By dawn I shall report to you that there is no one left alive in the Maiden's Tower. Good boy, Father said distractedly, already pulling on his armor. Bernard had better do the same. The women he sought might not be fighters, but there would still be guards, and Bernard had no desire to die. There was no longer a place at court for him, but if he did well tonight, there might still be a place for him in his father's service. If he survived the night. The allocated hour sped by, and in no time at all Lord Vauquelin sent his men marching into the valley where Beerhaven lay. Bernard wanted desperately to run, to head back to the court that he knew so well. There was no honor in this. To attack like robbers in the night, to slaughter them in their beds. The Baron of Beerhaven and his family had every right to this valley, that no one had cared about until now. If he hadn't sent a message to his father about the envoy from King Seward, this backwater barony might have remained forgotten. But Bernard was his father's son, and he'd learned a long time ago to be obedient to his father's wishes. So he'd written the letter and he marched now. Marching into darkness, and he did not know what, for who could see what awaited him in the dark? The stories alone of this place were enough to terrify anyone. May heaven help us all, Bernard whispered to himself. 3. That was the scrape of a sword coming out of a metal scabbard. Ursula was certain of it. She'd heard the sound only on the rare occasions when her father had drawn his weapon. Ceremonial occasions, on feast days, when she was expected to stand in the great hall along with everyone else. No one should be drawing weapons in the castle tonight. She crept over to the window, reaching up to unbolt the shutters, but the bolt was too high. Grumbling, she dragged a chair that had once been her father's over to the window so that she could reach the stubborn bolts. Finally, she'd unfastened the shutters. She pushed them open a tiny bit. From her room in the top of the tower, she could see the castle gates and clear across the valley, but what she saw threatened to stop her heart altogether. A river of men raced across the bridge, through the gate. Invading her home. She wanted to scream at them that they would never take Beerhaven, never, not while one of her people lived, but she had to warn her family, wake them up and get them out to safety. Ursula fumbled in the dark for a gown, not daring to strike a light. She put on the first one she found, shoving her stockinged feet into boots before seizing a cloak. She grabbed her dagger, wondering whether she'd need it. The clomp of footsteps on the stairs told her she would. Ursula whirled to face her visitor, trying not to let her hand shake too much as she pointed the dagger at the door. The man who emerged was breathless from the climb, doubling over the moment he reached the room. Then he straightened and Ursula saw it. The blue and gold blazon of Vauquelin across his chest. "Get out," she hissed, brandishing the dagger. Only then did he see her, his eyes widening inside his helm as he jerked back to avoid her blade. He snatched up her mother's chair just in time to avoid her second slash, which sliced open the fabric covering the precious chair, spilling out stuffing. He threw the chair aside, knocking the knife out of her hand, and took a step toward her. His hand closed around the hilt of his sword. Ursula swallowed, looking desperately around the room for another weapon she could use. Curse her stupidity for not thinking to keep a collection of swords up here. All she had was her father's chair, too hard to lift, let alone use as a weapon, and her own tiny stool. She grabbed the stool by one leg, hefting it like a hammer, and whacked it against the man's sword arm. Ow! She laughed and advanced, whacking him with the stool when he got within reach to drive him out. What she'd do then she didn't know. She could bar the door, but then how would she get out? She needed to get down the stairs, and this Vauquelin soldier was blocking the door. She aimed her next blow at his head, but he ducked and the stool smashed against the wall, leaving her holding nothing but one leg. A leg that ended in a point. Wishing it were a dagger, she thrust it at the man's face and he jerked back. And kept going down the stairs until he hit the wall and was still. Ursula paused, waiting for him to get up, but he didn't move. Surely with his leg bent at that angle, he should be screaming in pain. Unless the fall had killed him. Serve him right if it had. Cautiously, keeping to the inner curve of the staircase, she crept down to him. Even as she reached the steps where he lay, he didn't move. Dead then. Which she would be too if he'd caught her, or if any of his fellows did. She had to escape. Ursula forced her feet to move down the stairs. The corridor was eerily empty when she reached it. Perhaps the invaders hadn't reached here yet, and the soldier she'd killed was a scout or something. That was what they called the men who went ahead, wasn't it? Now she wished she'd listened to more of her brother's talk of war, instead of drifting into her own daydreams. Her brother's room was first, the door already ajar. She pushed the door open fully and whispered, "Giddy youths! Quick, wake up, we must go." But the boys in their beds didn't stir. They always had been heavy sleepers. She reached out and shook Giddy's shoulder. "Wake up," she hissed, then wished she hadn't. Her hand came away sticky. Sticky and warm. Still, she shook Giddy again. Only then did she realize how boneless he felt, like she was shaking a rag doll instead of a boy. Dead. He's dead. Her mind supplied the information, but she refused to believe it. She shook Yude's next and felt the unmistakable flow of blood over her hands. Someone had slit the boy's throat as he slept, and they'd probably done the same to Giddy too. The boys had never felt a thing. Her father would not go down without a fight, unlike his sleeping sons. Ursula headed for the passage, and the door to the next room. A body lay across the threshold. She lifted her foot to step over it, and a hand caught her ankle. Caught and held. "Invaders," the man coughed. "You have to get out." "What do you think I'm doing?" she hissed, shaking her foot free. "I must see my father first." "No, Ula, you have to get out. Go somewhere safe and hide. Father is dead." Only her family called her Ula, which meant. She stared at the man's face, blood bubbling over his lips like an obscene kind of carmine. "Jeffrey? Father's dead too. I tried to stop them but I couldn't. You're Behaven's only hope. Save yourself, Ula," he whispered, then slumped to the floor. Dead, like her other brothers. And her father. She stepped over Jeffrey's corpse, then took a deep breath and dared to look into Father's chamber. Short of the front door, her only way out lay through here. And past Orson, Baron of Behaven. Father had not had time to dress, but he had managed to seize a sword. That hadn't stopped his assassins though, for she counted no less than half a dozen bloody slashes in the front of his nightgown, his flesh gleaming wetly beneath. He lay on the hearth, like his dogs did in the great hall below, but that's where the similarity ended. His blood pooled beneath him, some of those slashes had run him through before he could reach the secret passage she needed. She wanted to fall to her knees beside him, begging his forgiveness for every uncharitable thought, every infraction, but she'd seen how many of Vauquelin's men entered the castle. One of them could return here at any moment, and she could not disobey Jeffrey's dying wish. Her father would want her safe. Ursula found the fake panel beside the fireplace that opened onto the secret passage. She risked one glance back. "Forgive me, Father," she whispered as she closed the door, shutting out all light as she headed into the dark and the safety it held. Her future couldn't possibly be any darker than the slaughter she'd left behind. 4. "I'm a knight, not a nurse," Bernard heard a man grumble. He didn't recognize the voice, but then his father had many knights and Bernard had spent more time at court than under his father's roof. His father's tone was unmistakable though. "You're my knight unless you plan on breaking your oath, and I don't tolerate oathbreakers. You'll stay here with him until he recovers or he dies, and we'll return in the spring." "The spring? My lord, your own physician said he could die before morning, and that it is unlikely he will wake at all. What if the boy's dead tomorrow? Then you will see that he gets a proper Christian burial, as my son deserves. There's no one left alive in the castle, so he has already been avenged, no matter who did this to him." Father's dark tone lightened. "Or perhaps we will have a miracle, and my son will recover. When we return in the spring, I will be sure to reward you for your part in returning my son to me. If he survives, he will surely be a cripple. Only half a man." Whoever owned the strange voice, he didn't have any problem sneering at Bernard. "My youngest son will never live up to his brothers. I gave up hope of that a long time ago. But his death will give us a perfectly acceptable justification when I must tell the king what happened here. They killed my son, and I merely responded to their act of war. The king might even prefer things this way." Bernard heard the scrape of a sword sliding out of its scabbard. "Why not just kill the boy now and say they did it? I will do the deed for you, my lord. If you kill my son, Goss, it will be the last thing you ever do. Whether he lives or dies is God's will, not yours or mine. That is why you will stay to care for him, while I lead my army home before we are snowed in for the winter." Bernard felt a surge of bitterness. He'd been the one to tell his father about the threat of being snowed in, and that the Baron of Beerhaven owed fealty not to their own king and his lords, but to a king and kingdom across the mountains no one had heard of for 50 years. The same king who'd sent a trade delegation to court. For days he'd labored in the king's dusty library, sending the monks mad looking for records related to this mysterious vanishing kingdom. But if he hadn't, he wouldn't have had anything to offer his father. To persuade him Bernard would be more valuable to him at home than at court. But then his father had found out about Dulcinea, and summoned him home anyway. Now it seemed he was to die in this secret snowy valley, that no one had thought much of for 50 years, much like the kingdom it guarded across the mountains. But if he didn't die, he would have a whole winter without his father, without the king, in another kingdom. Bliss, surely. All he had to do to enjoy this paradise was live and prove his father wrong. The voices had fallen silent, so Bernard dared to open his eyes. He was lying in a bed in a round stone room that looked very much like the tower where he'd met. It must have been some sort of harpy. Because no woman he'd ever met would fight with such ferocity. Why, she'd pushed him down the stairs, and he couldn't remember anything else until now. Unholy strength, unheard of ferocity. Either she was a witch or some sort of demon. Or a witch who consorted with demons. If she was so strong, then why hadn't she finished him off? Dread knotted in his belly. What if she'd already dealt him a killing blow, one that would kill him slowly in agony, and his father and Sir Goss knew, but he did not? He lifted his arms and inspected them. They seemed well enough. He patted down his belly and chest, breathing a sigh of relief when he found no wounds or bandages. Where else could a man take a mortal wound? His head, perhaps. Gingerly Bernard probed his scalp. Aside from one tender spot that didn't seem to be bleeding, his head was fine too. He sifted through his father's words to the night, and one closed its cold fist around his heart. Cripple. Bernard threw back the blankets and sat up. One leg was fine, sitting in all its hairy glory on the sheet. Oh, there was a bruise on his thigh where the harpy had hit him, but he'd suffered worse. It was his other leg that worried him, swathed in bandages that bound it to a plank of wood, which went all the way down to his heel. He could just see his toes peeping out at him like shy maidens. He gave them an experimental wiggle, then nearly screamed as pain shot up his leg. He dimly remembered feeling the same pain on the stairs, before oblivion had claimed him. Passing out from the pain, if his father heard, Bernard would never hear the end of it. Half a man indeed. Well, no man he knew had ever died of a broken leg. Some of the king's courtiers walked with a limp, especially those who had accompanied him on his holy crusade. Bernard would say it was a war wound and limp with pride. In fact, some of the men, himself included, had brought back some of their magical potion that was said to take away pain. Father's physician must have already given him something, for his leg hardly hurt at all if he didn't move it. It would wear off though, and he'd need more. Good thing he'd bought a plentiful supply of the stuff in the Holy Land, and brought it with him when he left court. But he'd left his things with the pack horses, not brought them with him. Had father thought to? Bernard scanned the room, hoping desperately for his things, but he saw nothing but chests and broken chairs and a woman's shredded gown. The harpy's work, he assumed. What if she came back to finish him off? Bernard swallowed. He was naked and defenseless in bed, and he could not climb out to search for a weapon either. But surely if she'd wanted to kill him, she'd have done so while he was unconscious, he reasoned. He could see sunlight through the window, though there was no warmth to be had from the wintry light. She'd had hours, and he was still alive. Taking a deep breath, Bernard swore that no matter what happened, he would survive. The day, the week, the winter, whatever it took. He would build his strength, so that when his father returned, he would have the courage to be the kind of man who would make his father proud. Not the weakling half-man his father thought he was. He'd better not tell his father about the harpy, though. His father would laugh himself sick at that. His belly growled, reminding him that he had yet to break his fast. He hoped someone would bring him food soon. 5. Ursula sensed rather than saw the secret passage open up into a space so wide it could only be a cave. The escape route was older than the castle, for the current keep had been built on top of it. Her grandfather had told her that their people had once lived in caves. When the snow on the mountains was deeper, the river had flowed higher and they'd shared the valley with bears. She'd believed the tales when he told them, but her brothers had only scoffed at them. Of course, Giddy and Eudes had promptly announced that if there were any bears left in Beerhaven, they would hunt them and use their skins to warm their beds. Beds that were cold now and would be forever, for her brother's boasting had been silenced by some foul hand. Ursula dashed away tears, glad no one could see them in the dark. There was no one left to see them. Better to think about bears than her brothers. Her grandfather had said she would know when the secret passage brought her to safety, because the bears would guide her. What bears she'd see in the dark she didn't know, but she did know she'd been walking most of the night, and still she didn't feel safe. If only she could transform herself into a bear, not the man-sized ones she'd heard lived in the mountains, but the huge ones that her grandfather's tales told about. 3 times the size of a man and weighing 3 times that again. Such a bear would have to live in a cave, for he wouldn't fit through the door of a house. A cave like this one. Ursula quickened her step, wanting to get out of this huge space to where she could touch the walls again. Somewhere safer, where no one and nothing could come at her out of the dark. Was there light up ahead? She headed for it instinctively, never considering that the light-bearer might be one of Vauquelin's soldiers. Luckily for her, the tunnel she entered was empty. A hole in the rock above sent down a shower of watery daylight. Dawn, Ursula realized. She'd been walking all night. No wonder she felt like her body had turned from flesh to stone, almost too heavy to drag another step. The dimly lit passage walls had a reddish tinge to them, like dried blood, but a closer examination revealed that the red was patchy. If Ursula squinted at it hard enough, it almost looked like a herd of horses, running in the same direction as she was headed. Following the horses seemed like as good an idea as any, so she did. There were more holes now, some in the ceiling above and some in the walls, so she could see when horses gave way to deer and some sort of large shaggy cow. All running away from something, like she was. Running to safety and not death, she hoped fervently. Her tunnel opened out onto a wider passage. One way led into the dark, while the other headed toward daylight. Ursula chose daylight, but she hadn't gone 3 steps before she came face to face with a bear. She let out a whimper of fright before she clamped her lips together, praying that no one had heard. The bear certainly hadn't, for it was just a picture on the wall. How anyone could draw a bear on a wall that looked like it was snarling at anyone who approached, Ursula didn't know. Another 3 steps carried her past the picture, and she turned to look again. Now the bear didn't look fearsome at all. It appeared to be staring down the passage into the darkness expectantly, sniffing the air. Behind him, more horses galloped toward her, heading into the cave, not out of it. Whoever had painted these pictures wanted her to take shelter down the dark passage, and not leave the cave. Her grandfather. Or someone even older, for who knew how old these tunnels really were. The only bear who wanted to guide her was painted on the wall, and he made it clear she should stay in the cave. Perhaps she should. At least she could lie down and attempt to get some sleep. After a rest, when the sun had climbed higher in the sky, then she could see what lay outside, and whether it would be safe to go home. Decided, she trudged into the dark. As she rounded the corner, so the bear vanished from sight, the air seemed to grow warmer with each step, like she was approaching a chamber with a fire. But a fire would give light, and the only light came from behind her, so she stuck her hands out in front of her to feel the way. Her fingertips touched cold stone, and finally Ursula stopped. The wall curved here, as far as she could reach, and she was too tired to take another step. So she lay down on the ground, tucking her cloak around her as closely as she could, and closed her eyes. Sleep was waiting. 6. Excruciating pain in his leg woke Bernard from his uneasy doze. He lashed out with a fist, and felt the satisfaction of hitting flesh. A voice down near his feet said, "I told you to keep the patient still." The pain in his leg impossibly grew worse. Bernard risked opening his eyes. His father's physician bent over his leg, hiding it from Bernard's sight. He was still, the man to Bernard's left muttered, giving him a dark look. "Until you woke him up. Dumb luck he hit me at all, really. He wouldn't be able to land a blow on me in a fair fight." Bernard hated to admit it, but the man was probably right. He'd had precious little arms training at court, for the king kept his pages far too busy to let them take their turn in the practice yard. Bernard had sneaked a few sessions in anyway, until the king had noticed his bruises and put a stop to it. He tried training with his father's men, but after the story had spread throughout the camp that Lord Vauquelin's son could scarcely keep hold of his sword, let alone fight with it, his father had commanded him to stop making a fool of himself. Something Bernard seemed doomed to do, no matter what he tried. The physician did something to Bernard's leg that made his vision go black, just for a moment, wrenching another agonized cry from Bernard's throat. "If I couldn't see his cock, I'd swear he was a girl," the other man mumbled. Bernard yanked his tunic down to cover himself. The last thing he needed right now was some stranger staring at his cock. "Have either of you seen my things?" he demanded. "If you mean your fine court clothes and womanish shoes, they're over there." The man pointed. Bernard stretched up until he could see his saddlebag sitting on the floor beside the bed. He prayed that no one had stolen his potion, for he'd need all its pain-curing properties to survive this torture. "Fetch them please," he said. The physician held up a hand. "I need you to stay still until I am finished. Sir Goss, hold him still, for this will hurt." So this was the man father had been speaking to, Bernard mused, shooting a sideways glance at the man. A night for a nursemaid. Bernard gritted his teeth and endured it, no matter how much he wanted to shout and swear and maybe even scream. "Are you done yet?" he asked finally, when his whole leg felt like it was on fire. "We need to get the cradle fitted around it, or I must send it back to the carpenter, so that a better one can be made." He motioned for Goss to help him. "I shall lift the leg, while you slide the cradle underneath." Bernard watched in horror while the physician raised his wool-cocooned leg, and Goss lifted a pine box onto the bed. The physician set his leg down into the box, like a body lying in a coffin. All he needed to do was nail it shut, and Bernard would know he'd lost the use of his leg for good. But the physician merely nodded. "Good, good. This will do. Make sure you pad the leg well with more felt when you've changed the bandage. In a week, you'll need to soak it thoroughly with water to loosen the bandage, then wash the leg. Use warm water, mind you, not cold, or you'll upset the healing humors. If there's swelling, cool the limb with a cloth soaked in vinegar. When it's dry, wrap the leg again in fresh linen bandages that you have soaked in melted wax, resin or lard. Then a layer of felt, before setting it back into the cradle. It must stay there for 2 weeks, not moving at all, or it will not heal straight. Then you may remove the bandage, but you must keep the patient in bed for 10 weeks. Only then may he get up and move about on crutches, but he should not leave this room for another week or 2 at least. So 13 weeks confinement in bed and another 2 in this chamber." "What are you telling me for? You're the physician. You'll be tending him, Goss said. The physician took out a handkerchief and wiped his hands. Lord Vauquelin commanded me to see to the boy, and educate you in his treatment. I am his best physician. He cannot leave me in some far-off barony for the duration of the winter. Now I have done as he asked, I had best join Lord Vauquelin, lest he depart without me. Snow has started falling, so we must make haste before the pass closes. He hurried out. Goss followed him. Wait, you can't just leave. He's Lord Vauquelin's son. Don't you ignore me. His voice grew increasingly panicked as he headed down the stairs, until Bernard could no longer hear the knight's whining. When he was certain the man had gone, Bernard reached down for his bags, lifting them onto the bed beside him. Womanish shoes indeed, he'd hated his court shoes, but the king had insisted all his personal staff wear those hideous heels on their already uncomfortable shoes. They'd come in useful for protecting his precious potion jars though, all the way from the Holy Land back to court. And now to here, where he would use the stuff for the first time. He fished out a bottle, then dug through his things for a drinking cup. Somewhere he'd stashed the paper on which he'd made the apothecary write down the name of the potion and its correct dosage, but Bernard remembered the turbaned man grabbing his hand, warning him never to take more than enough to cover the nail of his smallest finger, for too much would kill him. But the right amount would send him into a painless sleep where he would dream of paradise. Anything was better than this tower prison, trapped with his pain and dreams of the harpy who'd attacked him. So he poured out half a measure, just to be careful, and washed the bitter stuff down with a cup of water. Then he lay back and waited for the delightful dreams to come. 7. When Ursula woke, she wanted to stay in bed just a little longer. The winter furs were so soft and warm, embracing her like her mother used to do. She rubbed her face against them, letting out a little sigh of pleasure. The fur growled. Ursula's eyes flew open and she jerked away, falling from warmth onto cold hard stone. No. Not possible, she whispered, scooting away from where she'd slept until her back hit the cave wall. The enormous brown bear rolled over in its sleep, pulling her cub closer. An even bigger bear on the other side slept on, oblivious. Mother baby and father bear. She'd shared a cave with bears. No, she'd slept in the soft arms of the mother. A whimper escaped before she clapped a hand over her mouth to silence herself. To stay would be insanity, not safety. She crept out of the cave, back out along the passage to the picture of the snarling bear. Thank all that was holy that the very real bears hadn't woken, or she would have had to face 3 such snarling monsters. They would have ripped her to pieces. She'd been foolish to follow her grandfather's advice. Instead, she should find a spot where she could observe the castle unseen and work out what to do next. Ursula blinked as she stepped into the late afternoon sunlight. She'd slept all day, though it had been a short day at that. The sun set early with winter approaching. She pulled her cloak close to keep out the snow, then marched out of the cave's dubious shelter, following the path along the cliffs above the river. She was headed away from home, she knew, for the river was the surest road in the valley, but there was only one path, leading upward and away from the castle. Ursula ascended, step by determined step, glancing over her shoulder from time to see if the bears had woken, but the path was empty. Finally, the trees parted a little, allowing her a view all the way down the valley to her family home. Anyone peering through the tower window might see her, but no one else would be so high. Slowly she spun around, taking in the rock formation behind her, which she'd never seen up close before. From the tower and the village below, it resembled an enormous head with round ears, earning it the name of Bear's Head Rock, but now she stood upon the rock itself, it looked nothing like a bear. What looked like a snout from the ground was a rock tongue that jutted up and out over the river, a mighty erection that would put most men to shame. The jumble of rocks behind her parted in a dark cleft that led deep into the cliffs, deeper than the afternoon light could penetrate. Bears or any kind of beast could live in that cave. Or this could have been the safety her grandfather meant, instead of the cave where she'd slept. Ursula bit her lip. She would find a torch, and return to explore the new cave only when she had something to light her way and fend off wild beasts. If only her brothers were still alive to see it. They would have loved this. Tears sprang to her eyes. A man's shout down in the valley dragged her out of her grief. The voice was distant, but the sounds of marching feet could be heard even up here, echoing off the valley walls. Ursula's mouth dropped open and she couldn't seem to close it. Dozens of men marched in formation across the bridge, down the road toward the pass that led out of the valley amid the flurries of snow. They'd come in the night, killed her family, and now they were leaving? It made no sense. None of it did. Yet as she stood watching them leave, it dawned on her that Beerhaven was hers. And if the snow kept falling, within days no one would be able to enter or leave the valley until spring. That wouldn't bother her or any of the people of Beerhaven, for no one wanted to leave their homes, but Lord Vauquelin couldn't afford to leave his own lands unprotected for that long. For if he did, someone would surely do to his household what he'd done to hers. She wanted to run after him and rage at him for what he'd done, but she knew there was no point. He would kill her as easily as his men had slaughtered her family, and then where would she be? As dead as everyone else, which would not do. Her belly rumbled in agreement, reminding her that in order to live, she also needed sustenance. Yes. With Lord Vauquelin's army gone, it should be safe to head down to town, to find news and perhaps something to eat, before she dared to venture into the castle again. But she didn't want to go back into the dark again, where she knew bears lurked. There had to be a path down to the river from here. The bears had to eat and drink some time. She searched around the rocks until she found a faint track, wide enough for one person. Or a bear. It was steep but not impassable, and once she reached the river, it was an easy matter to follow it downstream to town and home. Or what had been home. Pressing her lips together to smother the scream of despair that wanted to escape, Ursula marched on. 8. An unholy clatter jerked Bernard from his dreams. "What in heaven's name is that?" he slurred. "Dinner. Don't go turning your courtly nose up at it, for it's all there is. Your father's men raided the kitchen and killed all the kitchen staff. It's empty but for the bloodstains on the floor. I suppose we should be grateful his men stayed long enough to bury the bodies instead of leaving them there to rot, or we wouldn't even have this." Bernard struggled to sit up, still drowsy from that potion he'd taken. "How long have I been asleep?" Goss shrugged. "Don't know. Most of the day, maybe. It'll be dark soon, so you can sleep some more once you've eaten. I'll stoke the fire and then I might retire myself. I've never slept in a baron's bed before. I bet I'll have the best night's sleep a man has ever known. Seeing as your father's seen fit to leave us little to eat, I'll probably spend all day searching the castle for its storerooms so we don't starve." "Starve? My father wouldn't let me." Bernard trailed off as he followed Goss's pointing finger to the plate on the table beside his bed, where a chunk of stale bread and a dried-out hunk of ham sat in unappetizing splendor. If he hadn't heard the clatter as the plate landed on the table, he would have bet money that the food had been sitting beside his bed for days. Horror froze his insides as he realized that might have been the case. The plate might have been sitting beside someone's bed for that long, and the original owner was now dead and buried, much like whoever had slept in this bed before he'd laid claim to it. And his father had said he didn't expect Bernard to live much longer anyway. Billa rose up in the back of Bernard's throat. "I'm not hungry," he said. Goss shrugged again. "Suit yourself. Break your fast on it in the morning then. Probably break your teeth on it too, if it's anything as hard as my dinner." Bernard opened his mouth to ask, then snapped it shut again. He didn't want to know. It was almost enough to make him wish he hadn't left the king's court. Almost. But not quite. 9. As Ursula approached the town, she knew something was wrong. It was too quiet. At this time of the afternoon, there should be the clonk of bells at milking time, the giggles of children playing, the shouts of adult voices as they reprimanded their children or greeted one another, the sting of smoke in her nostrils as kitchen fires were stoked to cook dinner. There was no smoke. On a snowy day in Beer Haven, it was tantamount to sacrilege, suicide, to let the house fires go out. So if the home fires weren't burning, everyone was already dead. Ursula choked back a sob. What kind of monster was Vauquelin, that he could slaughter everyone in the valley and leave like it was nothing? But he hadn't slaughtered everyone. Ursula squared her shoulders and straightened her spine. She still lived. And if she did, maybe someone else had survived too. That hope buoyed her up as she searched the first dozen houses, but it started to fade as she found nothing and no one. Empty kitchens and empty barns told the tale of everything the invaders had taken. Even the hen houses were silent, when normally the birds would be climbing into their roosts, clucking and rustling as they settled down to sleep. Her insides ached, though whether from hunger or anguish or both she did not know. Without food or the presence of someone, anyone to ease the pain, she forced herself onward. When she checked every house, she reached the curve in the road that led up to the castle. Ursula wanted to curl up in the middle of the road and cry for all she'd lost, but she could not. The castle called to her. It was home. She paused at the gatehouse, fancying that she'd heard a noise. A bird perhaps, or a mouse in the roof thatch. Or a soldier, left behind to guard the castle. Ursula froze. She had to hide. What had she been thinking, approaching the castle from the open road, where anyone could see her? "Stupid cat," a female voice spat. Ursula's breath whooshed out of her in a gush of relief. A striped tabby dashed out of the gatehouse, closely followed by a red-faced woman. "Alika?" Ursula asked. "Who are you?" Alika squinted at Ursula, then her eyes grew wide. "By all that's holy, Mistress Ursula, is that you? You managed to escape? What about your father?" Hope kindled in her eyes like a beacon. Ursula hung her head. "They killed him. My brothers too. Geoffrey told me to run." She should have stayed and fought alongside them. No, she should have learned to fight, so that she could have defended the castle with them instead of running away. But father had insisted that great ladies did not fight, much like they didn't practice magic, and father's word was law. Had been law. He'd wanted her to be the ideal wife to some high-born nobleman. He would have been horrified if he'd known she'd spent a night in a cave with bears. My Durwood said the same. It was my eldest daughter's wedding yesterday, so we were all in the village square long past dark, dancing. I know not who raised the alarm, but we took to the caves just like the people of old, and watched and waited for the army to leave. Alika raised her eyes to the rocky walls above, where generations past had carved whole houses into the rocks. Durwood headed for the castle to help fight off the invaders, but he never returned. My daughter does not sleep well unless the cat lies on her bed, so when the army left, I volunteered to come and search. 4. She wiped away a stray tear. I am sorry for your loss. Ursula's words seemed trite, a handful of dust thrown into a pit of despair. Alika glared at her. Do not say that. I will not believe it until I have seen the body with my own eyes. Durwood is not yet dead. Then she seemed to realize who she was speaking to, and ducked her head. Apologies, mistress. I did not think. Alika fell to her knees. Ursula waved away her apology. No one ever thinks they will see their loved ones murdered before their eyes. It is enough to addle anyone's mind. Oh, your poor dress. Let me give you something more suitable, mistress. Alika scrambled to her feet and raced back inside the gatehouse. Only now did Ursula glance down and realize she'd worn the mouse-chewed gown she'd laid on Giddy's bed. Was it only yesterday? The hem had already been torn to ribbons yesterday, but she'd caught it on the rough walls in the dark last night, so the skirt now hung in tatters. If it weren't for her thick woolen shift beneath, her legs would be on display for the whole world to see. Alika pushed open the shutters on the upper floor. "Come up, mistress, and see if this will fit." Ursula was torn between her desire to go home and her ardent wish to avoid the place altogether, if the bodies of her father and brothers still lay where they'd fallen. For the townspeople had fled before the army could kill them, which explained why the houses were empty of both the living and the dead. But the castle. A lady always accepted the hospitality of her people, from highest to lowest, Ursula told herself. Even if Alika offered her rags that were little better than the shredded dress she now wore, she would be honor-bound to accept the woman's gift, and wear it with both gratitude and pride. Of course Alika would give her no such thing. Durwood the gate captain had shared her father's table in the feasting hall on occasion, when there were no outsiders to entertain. If any woman in Beerhaven had a gown fit for a lady, it was Alika. The gown Alika held out was made of golden brown wool, which looked gold as it caught the last of the afternoon light. It was rougher stuff than anything Ursula owned, but fine enough to be Alika's Sunday best. Which it probably was, Ursula realized. As Alika helped her dress, Ursula mumbled something about returning the favor, having the castle tailor make something for Alika in thanks. Unless the tailor was dead too. Ursula had to force herself to return to the road, and when she did, she had a strong urge to run. The castle loomed over her like it wanted to crush her, killing her like the rest of her family. She wasn't sure she had the strength to enter those dark gates after what she'd seen. "When did you last eat, mistress?" Alika asked. Ursula had to think for a moment before she replied, "Yesterday morning." Alika exclaimed in horror. 2 days without a bite to eat? No wonder you look dead on your feet. Come to the caves with me. My daughter will have a pot of stew on the fire, and while I own it is not castle cooking, it is good food, the best kind for filling empty bellies. On the morrow, when you have slept, there will be plenty of time to investigate the castle. I'm sure Durwood will want to take you himself." Durwood was dead. Ursula wanted to shriek, but she didn't. Let the woman cling to hope if she wanted to. It wasn't Alika's fault that Ursula had none. Like a lamb to the slaughter, Ursula let the guard captain's widow take her wherever she wanted, for what did it matter anymore? 10. For the first time in her life, Ursula drowsed among her people, in a cave far more comfortable than the one in which she'd spent her morning. Though she was a woman grown, they'd placed her with the children at the very back of the cave. It was fitting, for she felt about as helpless as the toddler lying in the straw beside her, sucking on his chubby fist. "It's gone. He took it all. Our winter stores, everything." Silence greeted this dire pronouncement, broken by a tentative, "What of the castle? They must have something." "I checked the kitchen, the larder, the storerooms, even the wine cellar. They're all empty. We saw them take cask after cask out of the castle, until there was nothing left to take. It matters not whether we sleep here or return to our houses, we will starve to death before spring." The man who'd spoken stamped the snow from his boots and headed for the fire to warm his hands. Cries of disbelief came from those around him, and half a dozen pulled on cloaks, preparing to go outside and see for themselves. Ursula rose and marched to the fire. "He's right. Lord Vauquelin's army took everything of value and left. I searched every house myself. He took your winter supplies. He killed my father, my brothers, and then he took everything." "Mistress Ursula, you should rest," Alika said, but her concern was drowned out by calls for Ursula to tell them what had happened inside the castle, for no one who had gone in had returned. She took a deep breath and began. Everything from the soldier in her chamber, to taking the tunnel to the cave where she'd slept. And when I woke up, I found a bear family sleeping there beside me, so I left as quietly as I could and came back to town," she finished. "Bears. They have returned. The bears will save us. They will defend us just like before." The cries came from children, their eager eyes shining in the darkness. Their parents quickly hushed them. It seemed they'd also heard her grandfather's tales, but only children would believe them. One of the bears was a newborn cub, scarcely larger than one of our babies. I'm sure they only came because the cave was a quiet place where no one goes. I am only here because they preferred to sleep instead of attacking me, Ursula said. A man her father's age rose. Sounds like they're hibernating to me. A sleeping bear would surely wake if there was an intruder in their cave, especially with a cub so young. Besides, bears birth when they are hibernating. Ursula waved her hand. Sleeping, hibernating, it is all the same to me and as far from fighting as we can get. Besides, what would they fight? The invaders have left, taking everything with them before the pass closed. Even if we followed them, managed to catch up with them and demanded they give back what they took, there would be little left. An army that size would eat our winter supplies in a matter of days. But if we stay here, they would all starve. She didn't say the words, but she was certain they all thought them. If we stay here, our only chance of survival is to hibernate like bears, someone said. Several people laughed. But we're not bears, someone else muttered. But they could be. Ursula's mouth went dry as the idea took hold. If she disobeyed her father's orders, she could magic people into bears, so that they could hibernate. Well, maybe she could. She'd never tried to turn anyone into anything larger than a rat or mouse, but surely a bear couldn't be so different. I might be able to help with that, she said, so softly she hoped no one heard. But of course they did. People turned and stared. No one's had the gift in nigh over 100 years. Maybe even 200, the hibernation expert said. Other men nodded. What gift? Ursula asked. The gift that turns the people of Beerhaven back into bears. We were all bears once, you know, and the first Baron had the power to turn us into men. But when the valley is threatened, he turned everyone into bears again, the better to defend the valley. The hibernation expert puffed out his chest. One bear has the strength of at least 10 men, you know. Why, a dozen bears could have taken on that whole army. He peered at her. If you have the gift, then turn me into a bear right now. She hesitated. I've only ever turned my brothers into mice. Never anything so big as a bear. Have you tried, girl? Ursula shook her head. My father. Well, Baron Orson isn't here to do the job, so as his daughter, you'll have to do. Now can you turn me into a bear or not? The man demanded. Ursula bit her lip, waiting until she tasted blood to fuel the spell. It only needed a drop, but she wanted to be sure. She closed her eyes, thinking of the snoring he-bear. Hibernating he-bear. Whatever. She felt the magic flow out of her, shaping into the spell she told it to, infusing the man before her. It was certainly doing something to him, though she didn't know what. And she wouldn't until she dared to open her eyes. And met the dark brown eyes of a bear, wearing the most human look of surprise Ursula had ever seen on an animal's face. People clapped, and the bear grinned, displaying a mouthful of fangs. Ursula took a deep breath and changed him back again. Cheers erupted around her. The former bear looked delighted. Do that again. Other people clamored for her to change them too. Alika let out a piercing whistle that silenced them all. The girls lost her family, not eaten a bite for 2 days, and scarcely slept in that time either. Let her rest. In the morning, when she is not dead on her feet, then we will see how many of us she can save. One night won't make a difference. Around her, men and women muttered their agreement, as they retreated into the shadows to lie in their own beds, or at least the pallets where they planned to sleep. Ursula thanked Alika and started to stumble back to bed, more exhausted than she'd realized. "It's us who should be thanking you. If you have the gift of your ancestors, you have the power to save us all. You're the true mistress of Beerhaven, and everyone among us will defend you to the death," Alika said. More blood on her hands? Didn't she already have enough? If her father had already negotiated the marriage with Lord Vauquelin's son, then he might not have felt the need to attack, and her family would still be alive. Durwood would still be alive. Ursula mumbled something that seemed to satisfy Alika, before climbing wearily beneath the blankets. She fell asleep the moment her head touched the straw. 11. The bread and ham was long gone, and Bernard feared he'd run out of water soon, as he'd used most of it to soak the food into something soft enough to chew. Goss had not returned from his night in the Baron's bed. He wondered what Goss would say if he told him he'd spent many nights in a king's bed, and it was not something he'd wish on any man. Or boy, though his father had wished it on him. Had his father known about the king's tastes when he'd sent Bernard to court? Bernard wasn't sure what was worse, if his father had known but sent him anyway, or if he didn't know and probably wouldn't believe a word of it if Bernard told him the truth. What did it matter anyway? His father was on his way home, the king and his court would never come here, and Bernard was likely to die of starvation or infection or something else equally horrible before spring. And the king's dirty secrets would die with him. About the time the fire died out completely, Goss returned, carrying a sack and a thunderous expression. "This is what Lord Vauquelin left us as supplies for the winter." He upended the sack on the table. Carrots, a few apples, half a small ham, a cheese that looked like it had seen better days. "That won't last us a week," Bernard said. Goss nodded. "The good news is there is plenty of wood cut. Enough to keep the fire burning in here for a year or more. I'll bring up some more wood before it gets dark. There is water aplenty, or we can melt snow, but if I do not stumble across a great storehouse of foodstuffs in that tiny village down by the river, I'm going to have to go hunting." He pointed at the sack. "It might not last both of us a week, but it is more than enough for a sick man for that time. For it might take me a week to find something worth shooting to bring back." Bernard swallowed. A week, alone and helpless in this castle? What if there were vengeful ghosts? What if the harpy returned? He almost laughed at himself. Ghosts and harpies? He should be more worried that his father's men had missed someone very much alive and real and seeking revenge. "Help me make a bed on the floor nearer the fire so I can keep it burning while you are gone," Bernard said. At the disgusted look on the knight's face, he added, "Please. For if you don't, the fire will most definitely go out, and how would you explain to my father that you let his son freeze to death?" Goss grudgingly agreed, and he even helped Bernard shift from the bed to the pallet by the hearth, an excruciatingly painful exercise that had them both swaying. Bernard knew it would be some time before he'd manage to leave the tower, if ever. It wasn't until he'd left that Bernard thought to ask for a cooking pot, and by then it was too late. Bernard sighed. He'd give everything he owned for a single kitchen maid to have survived his father's massacre, a maid who might look kindly on him and nurse him back to health. For between Goss's glowering and cursing, Bernard feared that this time the knight might not come back. And if he didn't? Bernard swallowed. If Goss didn't return, then Bernard might have to choose between dying of starvation or freezing. Perhaps he would get to put his sword to good use after all. 12. Ursula had never performed so many spells in her life. If she'd known how exhausting it would be, perhaps she might not have offered. But then, what was a little work when it meant her people would live through the winter? It wasn't like she had anything better to do, and this was as least useful. Sitting in her tower all day stitching yet another tapestry helped no one, least of all herself. For who really needed a new tapestry anyway? It took her a week before she'd turned the last men into bears. Mothers and children had been first, then those too old to fight, before their menfolk on the final day. That night she stretched out on the same pallet that had been hers since she arrived, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Bears fell asleep faster than people, she'd found, not that she would ever know why. For her magic had one weakness: she could change anyone else into a beast, but the magic wouldn't work on her own body. The sky was clear tonight, and the full moon rose high above the cliffs, lighting her path. She'd taken the last of the food in the bear's cave, a small pouch of oats and a piece of cheese. No one else would need it. Not before spring. And by then, some other creature might have stolen it anyway. Ursula considered hiding in one of the houses in town for a day, but that would be cowardly, and what would be the point? The castle was her home, and if anywhere had the stores to see her through to spring, it would be her father's castle. The townspeople might be as much a part of Beerhaven as she was, but the secrets of the castle had been passed down through her family, and those who had served them for generations. Under the castle was a veritable labyrinth of caves, cellars and passages, which took days to fully explore. Lord Vauquelin's men couldn't have found all of them. The castle was dark, not a single torch was lit. She didn't need light to see her way though, she had lived within these walls all her life. She moved on soundless feet up to where her family's apartments were, the only sign of life anywhere. She paused outside her father's chamber, expecting to see Geoffrey's body still lying where he fell, but the stones were empty. Lord Vauquelin's men had even taken the bodies. Ursula prayed they'd given them a decent burial. On the morrow she would search the castle grounds for the graves. But now she wanted to retire to her own bed, in her own chamber. A place where there would be no bodies, no blood, and no bears. She crept upwards, following the spiral stair to the bedchamber where she'd slept every night of her life, excepting this past week. She wanted to fall into bed and forget all of this had ever happened, if only for one night. Ursula pushed the door open and hesitated on the threshold. The room smelled strange, stale, like it had been shut up too long. She would throw the shutters open and air it in the morning, she told herself sleepily, stumbling toward the bed. She tumbled into the feather mattress, sinking deep into its softness. So much nicer than the hard floor of a cave, even cushioned by a thin layer of straw. All she had left to do was dream of better days, which she soon did. 13. Dawn found Ursula in the kitchen, attempting to light the fire. Tinder and kindling she had aplenty, and she'd seen the servants lay enough fires to know how it was done, but without a flint to light the thing, she was lost. She searched the kitchen in the early morning light, but came up empty. Lord Vauquelin's thieving army had stolen even the flint from the kitchen, the bastards. She had one in her chamber, which should hopefully still be there. Sighing, she trudged up the stairs, bucket of water in one hand and pot of oats in the other, the spoon clinking in the pot with every second step. If there was anyone left in the castle, they couldn't help but hear her. Still, she did nothing to silence the sound. As the only person awake in the valley, it was comforting to hear some sign of life. It was almost like not being alone. Ursula pushed open the door with her elbow, and set the pot and bucket on the hearth. Sure enough, her tinderbox was still here, so she busied herself laying and lighting a fire. It was better this way, she'd want the warmth of it in here, and it was too much work to keep the kitchen fire going and the one up here. Especially if she had to carry the wood up from the yard, for there was precious little here. She thanked heaven that the fire caught quickly, but still she held her breath as she placed a log on the fire. She almost cheered when it began to burn. But that log was all she had, and it would not last long. Ursula set the pot of oats on the hearth in the same spot her maids had placed her breakfast to keep warm for as long as she could remember, and pulled on her cloak to go fetch more wood. In the yard, she was delighted to discover the one thing Vauquelin's army hadn't stolen, the woodpile, now hidden under a thin layer of snow. She knocked the logs against one another to dislodge the snow, before piling them into a half-barrel to carry upstairs. When she'd filled the tub, she tried to lift it, but she couldn't. Swearing softly, she tipped out half the wood and tried again. Better. At least it would be enough for the day. She could come down for more when she'd eaten her breakfast, which would surely be ready by now. How long did oats take to cook anyway? She tipped the firewood on the stone floor and reached for the pot with her gloved hands. She pulled one glove off so that she could grasp the spoon, stirring it before lifting a spoonful to her lips. She almost spat it out again. A spoonful of cold water with gritty uncooked oats wasn't a fit breakfast for pigs, let alone herself. Ursula hung the pot on the hook over the fire, where her maid usually put a kettle when she wanted a hot tisane to help her sleep. Then she headed outside for more wood, as there was no point watching water boil, or whatever it did. The firewood made a satisfying clatter as she tipped it out, and by her third trip, she thought she might have enough to do her for a few days. Her arms ached from the unaccustomed work, which she hoped she wouldn't have to do again for a while. Surely now her breakfast was ready. The pot was bubbling, which was probably a good sign. She fished out a spoon of the stuff and lifted it to her lips. "What are you making?" Shocked at the sudden male voice, Ursula tipped the whole spoonful into her mouth, scalding her tongue. She swore, then fumbled at her belt for a weapon, putting her back to the wall. "Get out of my chamber," she hissed, brandishing her eating knife. 14. Bernard slipped in and out of consciousness, helped in no small part by his magic potion. Sleeping so much meant he had less appetite. He had no idea how long it had been since Goss left, but as he was now down to one last, wrinkled apple, he figured it must be at least a week. He needed more food, more wood, more water, and hadn't the physician said his bandages would need changing about now? If only his leg would stop hurting. He'd never known pain like this before, and more than once he'd considered using his own sword to end it. But he was not that desperate yet. Twice he'd woken to find the fire had gone out, and he'd had to relight it or freeze. But that couldn't be the case this time, he thought. The fire burned merrily in the grate, and something was bubbling on the hook above it. Goss must have returned. Bernard sat up, taking a deep breath so that he might savor the smell of whatever Goss was cooking over the fire. He was disappointed to smell little more than boiling water. Perhaps it was to change his bandages. That thought perked him up a little. He'd asked Goss how hunting had gone, and perhaps they would be feasting on fresh meat before the day was done. His mouth watered at the prospect. The door opened, and Bernard opened his mouth to greet the knight, and thank him for returning. For, truth be told, Bernard had not truly believed the man would return. After all, if his own father did not care whether he lived or died, how little could his life mean to some random knight? But Bernard's voice died in his throat as he saw who emerged. A maiden in a dull brown dress, carrying a tub full of wood, stepped into the room and dropped her burden on the flagstones. She did not seem to care how much noise she made, or acknowledge him at all. Perhaps she did not like having to serve the son of the man who had killed her compatriots. Bernard could understand that. He watched her for a moment, as she knelt on the hearth to taste the contents of the pot. Curiosity overcame his caution, and Bernard asked her what she was cooking. The effect was immediate. The girl dropped the spoon, swaying with words mild enough to have come from the lips of a court lady, before she backed up against the wall and drew her dagger. "Get out of my chamber," she shouted. Her chamber? Bernard wanted to laugh. This chamber had belonged to a harpy, and now to him. He squinted at the girl, wondering. Could she be the harpy? The woman who had attacked him with such ferocity, throwing him down the stairs and leaving him in his current plight? A spirited maidservant indeed. No wonder she had survived, when so many of her people had died. He swallowed. If she attacked him again, she would kill him for sure. And crippled or not, Bernard still very much wanted to live. So he marshaled all his powers of persuasion and tried to reason with her. "I must beg your forgiveness, mistress," he began carefully. "I would dearly love to do as you say, for I have no desire to trespass on the hospitality of such a lovely lady as yourself. But I cannot. For as you see, I am too crippled to move." He twitched the blanket aside so that she might see his bandaged leg. It seemed he'd only stoked the fire in her eyes. She brandished the knife even more wildly. "I don't care how crippled you are. I said get out." "Alas, I cannot. My leg is broken from landing badly on your own stairs. I cannot move or walk, and I have not eaten in days. But even if I had the strength, it will still be many weeks before I can limp down those stairs." Bernard bowed his head. "I fear I must trespass on your hospitality, whether I will it or no, my lady. I hope you can find it in the charity of your heart." Her eyes widened. "You're the soldier who attacked me. I thought you were dead. You should be dead after all the people you have killed." She advanced on him, the dagger held out in her shaking hand. If he was not mistaken, there was murder in her eyes. He held up his hands in surrender. "My lady, I beg you. I have not killed anyone. No man, woman or child. I mean you no harm." He swallowed, trying to moisten his dry throat, but it was no use. "Truly, I mean you no harm. The same cannot be said for you, for if I'm not mistaken, you are the one who threw me down the stairs. I do not know by what miracle I survived such a fall, but as all miracles are God's work, surely it would be the devil's work to take a life that God has seen fit to save." She crept closer, keeping the knife between them as she took in his bandaged leg. "Why didn't they take you with them?" She narrowed her eyes with suspicion. "The physician said I was too injured to move. I even heard him say he was not sure if I would survive such a wound. My comrades left me some supplies and my things, as you see." He gestured toward his saddlebags. She surveyed the room, her eyes missing nothing. Slowly she said, "They did not leave you enough supplies for the winter. They left you here to die." Unable to meet her eyes any more, Bernard bowed his head and nodded. "What have you done, soldier, that your comrades would sentence you to such a slow and lonely death? It must have been something terrible." She edged away from him again, more wary than before. "I have committed no crime, lady, that I promise you. Unless by not killing another man, I have committed what the rest of the army felt was a crime. In times of war they call it cowardice, but I've never drawn my sword in anger. I am not a soldier, and my father was a fool to think I could be turned into one." He gestured at his leg. "Even if I survive, I may never walk again." Still she stared at him. "So if I were to walk out of this room, close the door behind me, and never return, what would you do?" He lifted his eyes to meet her gaze. He could lie, but what would it matter? They both knew the truth. If she left him, he would die. "I would probably shout through the door, begging you to come back. When I realized such a thing was futile, I would probably turn my attention to the pot you have kindly brought up here, and hope that whatever it contains might sustain me for another day. Once I have regained a little of my strength, I would attempt to change the bandages on my leg, for that is what the physician said I must do. What Goss must do, but Goss was not here and might never return," Bernard thought but didn't say. "Eventually, out of desperation, I would probably try to crawl down those steps and find the kitchen. If I did not break my neck in the process, I imagine you would find me under the kitchen table, gnawing on a table leg, so mad from hunger I could not tell the difference between a table leg and a leg of lamb." The hint of a smile twitched at her lips. "I could not allow you to do that. That table is older than the castle itself. In my madness, I fear you might not be able to stop me. For it is well known that madness gives a man inhuman strength." She took a step further away from him. Her wariness returned. "What do you want here, soldier? Do you wish for me to kill you, for you are surely my enemy, and hence save you from the unforgivable sin of suicide? Tempting though the offer was, Bernard knew what his answer had to be. He'd had a long week to ponder it after all. No, lady. I would not wish my blood to mar your lovely hands. I want what any man wants, to live and be free. Only allow me to stay until I can walk once more, and I shall leave this place, never to let my shadow darken your door again. She stared at him, seeming to weigh his very soul before she finally answered, I am no lady. I am only Ursula, the last person left alive in Behaven. He summoned a warm smile. The same sort that had charmed Dulcinea and won her trust, before it had damned her and him both. Mistress Ursula, you are no longer alone. I can help you. She laughed. Genuine, heartfelt laughter, the sort of merriment he hadn't known in so long. Crippled and confined to bed. You must have valuable talents indeed, if you can still use them in your current state. Oh, if only she knew. I am crippled, yes, but I can still warm a bed. When the nights grow too cold to sleep alone, I offer my services. He bent forward, the closest thing he could manage to a bow. You have the wrong woman for that, soldier. There were some women who lived in the inn who might have been willing to serve your needs if you have the coin for it. But your army emptied my valley, so you will find a cold welcome at the inn tonight, even if you could reach it. He'd angered her. She might use genteel swear words, but she was no court lady. He must remember that. Though court ladies certainly could not cook. Could she? He darted a glance at the pot. Whatever you're cooking in that, it does not smell like food should. She set her hands on her hips. It's porridge, and it smells like that because it is not ready yet. Bernard shuffled closer to the fire until he could reach the spoon, and stirred the pot. Oats floated up, then sank back down into the depths. It'll never be ready at all if you cook it like this. There's too much water in the pot. Before she could stop him, he wrapped his sleeve around his hand and pulled the pot off the hook. He poured half the water into the water bucket, before returning the porridge pot to the fire. There. Now it should be ready in a few minutes. I could cut my apple into pieces and add it to the pot, to give the meal some flavor, but what would really improve it is some cream and honey. You know how to cook? She looked like she didn't believe a word of it. Bernard grinned. Of course. It's a long road to the Holy Land and back, and a boy who could cook only became more valuable in a camp without women. You are a crusader? You have seen the Holy Land? Her mouth didn't seem to want to close. Admiration appeared in her eyes, chasing away suspicion. You are a holier man than I thought. Have you truly never taken another's life? I swear by my life, I have never killed anyone. Not even while I was on that most holy crusade. He fought to keep the sarcasm from his tone. She did not need to know what an unholy nightmare the campaign had been. A holy man whose life was saved by a miracle. Perhaps I was wrong. You may stay, holy man, but there must be no talk of warming beds or any such thing. And you must cook. We have an accord. Whatever food you bring me, I shall do my best to cook. 15. Whatever food she brought him? The oats were all she had left, and what was it he'd asked for? Honey. If the army had left the hives, they would be sleeping under the snow, there would be no honey. But there might be some in the storerooms if the army had missed one. Stay here. I'll see what there is, she said, dashing for the door. It wasn't until she was halfway down the stairs that Ursula realized the man had no choice but to remain. Unless he was lying about his injury. But she'd seen his body on the stairs. It would have taken a miracle to make a man survive that. A miracle he'd probably earned. May God forgive her for trying to kill him. Would he forgive her? Perhaps if she found some honey and food enough to see them through the week, it would help. The fastest way to the storerooms was through the secret passage in her father's chamber. Ursula hesitated on the threshold, but there was nothing to see. Her father's body was gone, and the bed covers had been drawn up, as though ready for their master's return. Even if he would never return. She turned her eyes from the bed to the hearth. Geoffrey had told her to save herself, and she would. Only this time, she wasn't running. She was searching. The first cellars she checked were empty. That was as it should be. The winter stores weren't moved to the cellars adjacent to the castle kitchens until the first snowfall. The first snow had fallen, so now it was time. The stillroom and the buttery should have been full, but the army had been here too, stealing even that last day's milk, which should have been in the buckets on the bench still, waiting for the cream to rise to the top. There would be no cream for the soldier upstairs. There was no cow or goat left in the valley to produce milk. Ah, but cheese. Beerhaven was famous for its cheeses, some of which took a year or more to mature. In darkness, not the well-lit buttery. The door to the cheese cave was hidden in plain sight, for it was the floor-to-ceiling cabinet that held the molds, buckets, churns, and other tools of a dairymaid's trade. At least, that's what she thought they were. Ursula had never been allowed to spend much time here, but the cellars were a different matter, for they held the prosperity of Beerhaven. Ursula was glad she'd brought a candle with her, for the torches that had lit this tunnel on her previous visits were dark and cold. Down into the stone, she emerged into the low-ceiling cavern, home to the finest aged cheeses on the continent. Cheeses that fool Vauquelin hadn't found. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with the ash-dusted wheels of Beerhaven soft cheese. Dried mushrooms hung from the ceiling like bunches of mistletoe at Yuletide. Deeper in the cave was where they stored the wax-dipped hard cheeses, aging them until they crumbled at a knife's touch. The aged cheeses had a story behind them, like everything in Beerhaven. In her great-grandfather's time, the king had sent a wagon over the mountains every year to collect his tithe, and Beerhaven paid in hard cheese. So when the wagon did not arrive, the cheeses remained in the cave. Another year passed, and still no wagon came. Her great-grandfather sent men into the mountains, to see whether the pass was blocked. But the mountain passes were perfectly clear until the snow line, where a massive hedge blocked the way. An impenetrable magical hedge, or so the story said. Assuming the wagon would return once the hedge was dealt with, her great-grandfather had taken the wagon loads of aged cheese to a neighboring king. Not as tithe but for sale. He'd returned with a bag of gold, and orders for more the following year. Every year the wagon didn't come, he sold the cheese. And every year he received more gold. Gold he held in trust for his own king, for it was his tribute and not Beerhaven's. 50 years had passed since then, and last year's cheeses were not yet ripe for market, though it was a market they might never reach, if this new King Siward wanted the cheeses for himself, as King Almos had. But their dairy herds had increased since her great-grandfather's time, and there would be cheese enough to see her and perhaps even the soldier through the winter without touching the tithe. Today she kept going, wanting to see the legendary chests for herself. For if the army had stolen King Siward's gold, there was no telling what would happen when the king's envoy came in spring. The narrow chamber flared out, so that her light barely touched the walls. There were barrels here thick with dust and chests. She flipped open the catch of the first chest and pushed up the lid. Candlelight flickered on countless silver coins, almost filling the chest. She opened the one beside it, and saw the glitter of gold before she had to drop the heavy lid down again. What of the casks then? She set her candle down on the lid of one, which was stamped with what appeared to be a rose. They all bore the same mark, which wasn't one she recognized. Ursula found a pry bar, which she used to lever the cask open. She leaned over to peer inside, taking a deep breath. And stepped back, light-headed, for the fumes wafting off the liquor inside were enough to intoxicate the strongest man. From several feet away, she sniffed again. Without the overpowering scent of spirits overwhelming her, she thought it smelled like berry wine. Wine and cheese, wonderful. If the army had left them nothing else, this would see her through until spring. She maneuvered a cask to the kitchen, then returned to the cavern for a cheese and a string of mushrooms. She wasn't sure how she'd get all this up to the tower, but at least it was a start. She closed the door carefully behind her. With a much lighter heart and feet that wanted to dance, she set off to catalogue what else the stupid soldiers had missed. 16. Bernard's insides ached with hunger as he stared at the pot of cooked oats, but he didn't dare eat his share until the girl returned. They were hers, after all. His leg pained him, for the last potion he'd taken had long since worn off, but he didn't dare take any more. It dulled his wits worse than strong wine, and he would need all his faculties to convince the girl he was as harmless as he said he was. He didn't blame her for being suspicious of him, but it hurt that she thought so little of him and men in general, that she would doubt his word. He might be Lord Vauquelin's youngest son, but noble blood ran in his veins. However unpleasant that duty had been, he had been the personal page of the king himself. His honor was as precious to him as his own life. Finally, Ursula opened the door. She carried a basket full of things, and wore a smile so brilliant he couldn't help staring. She set the basket on the floor, rummaged through it, then triumphantly held out a jar. Honey! Bernard took the jar from her, hardly daring to believe it. He pried off the lid, and felt his eyes grow wide as he found it full to the brim with crystallized honey. Wherever this jar had come from, it was cold enough to turn honey solid. He measured out a spoon and stirred it through the porridge, watching the stuff melt together. His mouth watered in anticipation of the best meal he'd eaten in a week. Bernard had to force himself to hand the spoon to Ursula. Ladies first. She tasted the porridge, then passed the spoon back. It's just right. I didn't think to bring bowls or extra spoons, but right now I'm too hungry to care. You must be too. We'll share. She watched him take a large spoonful, then served herself again. And so it went, until the pot was empty. That was good, she said as she set the empty pot on the hearth. You sound surprised. It would be better with cream. I take it you didn't find any of that while you were gone? Of course not, she huffed. Vauquelin took every beast we had. I did find cheese, mushrooms, some pickled vegetables, a few bags of flour, goose confit, and the Yule hams. Oh, and some wine. She lifted a wineskin out of the basket. Bernard stared in wonder. Had Goss lied, or had his father's men missed so much? Perhaps his father had left him enough supplies to last the winter after all. More than ever, that meant Bernard had to survive, if only to show his father he was not the weakling he thought him to be. But he needed fresh bandages on his leg, and he'd need help to change them. Would Ursula help him? There was only one way to find out. The physician said I would need fresh bandages after a week. Is there any linen I might use? And some wax or resin. Something I can melt to make a hard cast outside the healing bone when it sets. Ursula rose. There was some beeswax with the honey, and there should be bandages in the still room. I shall fetch them and stay to help. You don't have to, he said. Her head snapped up. Of course I do. You cannot put a plaster on your own leg. One of the stable boys broke his leg when a horse fell on him while my mother was still alive. The castle carpenter made a little cradle for his leg, to keep it still. Perhaps I can find it in the lumber room. No need. Bernard pointed to the box, half hidden under the bed. The physician had one made for me before he left. After the bandages are dry, we must pack it with felt and lay it in the box. It still looked like a coffin. Ursula's thoughts must have been in a similar vein, for she said, Do you know if Vauquelin gave the men of the castle a proper burial? There was hardly time for them to make coffins for everyone, but... She wiped away a tear. She'd lost someone she loved in the massacre. Maybe everyone. "I don't know," he admitted, wishing he could say more. If his father were here, he would ask him, just to be able to lay her mind at rest, like whoever she'd lost. "I'll go get the necessary things so we can do this now," she said, and marched out. Bernard would have given everything he owned to be able to follow her, but he was stuck on the floor in a tower he couldn't escape. At least there was wine. And perhaps a little of that magic potion to take the edge off the pain. Crying out under the physician's hands was one thing, but screaming when Ursula touched him? No, that simply would not do. 17. Ursula thought it would be a simple matter of unwinding one set of bandages and then winding new ones around his leg, the work of a moment surely. But the strips of linen that currently shrouded his leg had been soaked in something that glued the strips together into a sort of protective shell around his leg. And if she understood his instructions correctly, she would have to melt the beeswax and soak the new linen in that before wrapping him up again. She wasn't sure how turning his leg into a giant candle, missing only the wick, would help it to heal, but she resolved to do as he asked. She wanted to see this injury for herself, to know whether this man was truly the harmless cripple he claimed to be. She felt his eyes on her as she busied herself melting wax and warming the water that he insisted would dissolve the current cast. When the water was warm enough, he shifted himself to the edge of his pallet so that his injured leg sat on bare stone. She poured the water carefully over the length of his leg, trying to let the felt sop it up before it could form a puddle on the flagstones. When the first bucket was empty, she picked up the second. "I can feel the water," he said, his eyes shining. "It's working." When she set down the second bucket, Ursula picked up a pair of scissors. He'd wanted her to use a knife to cut through the sodden bandage, but she was terrified of cutting him. She snipped through the layers of felt and wool slowly, carefully, not brave enough to look at his face, in case she hurt him. But as he made no sound to indicate he was in pain, her strokes grew bigger and braver, until finally, the cast slid away to reveal skin almost as pale as the bandages which had covered it. She reached for the third bucket and the cloth to wash his leg. There were 2 breaks, not one. Each was a ghastly grey, rimmed with purple and red, then haloed in a yellow too sickly to belong to any scent. His whole leg was consumed by these 2 massive bruises. Bruises she had caused. She stopped and swallowed. I am sorry. I did not mean to hurt you. I feared for my life and I panicked. Now I'm afraid to touch it, lest I cause you more pain you do not deserve." The cloth dropped from her limp hand into the bucket with a soft splash. Then his hand was there, fishing about in the bucket, pulling out the cloth, squeezing out the excess water before pressing it back into her hand. "Mistress Ursula, your ministrations are anything but painful. If anything, your touch heals me. Please do not stop." She raised her eyes to meet his in surprise. She didn't know him well enough to be sure whether it was truth or a lie, but his reassuring smile urged her to believe him anyway. So she stroked the cloth from his ankle to the top of his thigh, then back down again over bruises, breaks and all. True to his word, he did not flinch or make a sound. As she worked, she lowered her eyes again, so that he might not read her thoughts. He was a brave soldier, a kind man who had never killed, and a holy man who had gone on a crusade. She did not deserve his forgiveness for what she had done, but if she nursed him back to health, perhaps she would pay a small part of the penance she owed him. 18. Bernard gritted his teeth, forcing himself not to make a sound. Even the lightest touch to those dark places where he knew his bones were broken felt like the fires of hell itself. It mattered not. He could not ask her to stop, for the bandages needed to be changed, and he could not do them himself. Her hands were gentler than the physician's, he had to admit. The harpy, it seemed, had flown off, leaving this surprisingly sweet girl in her place. But all this warmth and stroking was having an effect he had not considered, and the proximity of the pretty girl wasn't helping matters. When he bared his leg, he'd made sure his tunic covered everything else, but he couldn't hide the rising tent in his tunic, nor could he stop it. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to think of cold things, dead things, anything but the girl he wanted to pull onto the pallet beside him. She seemed so intent on her work though, that she had not noticed his arousal. Or perhaps this sweet maiden had never seen a man in such a state, and so she thought nothing of it. If only he could stop thinking about it. When his leg was dry, she started with the new bandages. First a layer of clean linen, followed by a second layer of linen that had been soaked in wax. A third layer made of felt completed the job, before she laid his leg in its wooden coffin. She tucked scraps of felt into the box to cushion him from the hardness, then laid a blanket over the top of it, folding it into a pad on the inside of his leg so that he might not injure the other leg while he slept. He was too busy watching her that he didn't realize quite how high her hands had crept. No longer level with his knees, her hand had reached the bare skin at the top of his thigh, and more besides. His cock, as eager for her touch as any other part of him, moved as though it had a mind of its own. She cried out and snatched her hand back, staring wide-eyed at his escaped cock. He tucked it away too late, for he feared the damage was done. She muttered something about washing her hands, scrubbing them violently in a bucket, as she bowed her head in a fruitless attempt to hide her flaming cheeks. "Thank you, Mistress Ursula," he said. "Now thanks to you, I may one day walk again. If there is any way in which I can repay you—" But she'd snatched up her buckets and fled from the room. Probably a good thing, he thought sourly, eyeing his wayward cock. There was only one way to tame it now, and some things were not fit for a blushing maiden's eyes. 19. Ursula ran all the way to the kitchen, careless of the water sloshing onto her skirt. She poured herself a cup of the strong berry wine and drank it down in 3 gulps, hoping it would settle both her churning belly and her shaking hands. She touched his manhood. She touched the manhood of a man who was not her husband. What would her father say? She'd never get a husband now. For what man would want her, knowing that she touched another man's? She blew out a shaky breath. Not just touched it. She'd stretch her hand out and stroke the length of it, just the once, wanting to know what it felt like. Harder than his leg, yet the skin had been so much softer. How was that even possible? She could ask him, she supposed. But of course she could not. Touching him like that, why, it was not just unseemly. It was the sort of thing a man expected from one of the tavern girls, not the Baron's daughter. Never mind that she wanted to. She could not. She would not. He was a holy man. He had no desire to steal her virtue, but she could not explain that wicked flood of lust that had overwhelmed her, if only for a moment, before she had regained her faculties. She would not let it happen again. She would not, she repeated as she forced her feet to carry her back to her chamber, and him. He'd stretched out on his pallet by the fire, already asleep, she hoped. "Good," she said softly. "You sleep there, and I shall sleep in my bed, and honor shall be satisfied." 20. Bernard had intended to pretend to be asleep, but her words or perhaps her tone stirred up emotions that would not rest. "Honor is never satisfied," he said bitterly. "Honor always demands more of you, sometimes more than any man is willing to give." She was silent for a long moment before she finally said, "I do not understand." No, of course she did not. He envied her the innocence that had been stolen from him, but not enough to want to steal hers. A holy crusade is still a long journey, and many things may happen along the way. The things I have done for honor. He shook his head, not wanting to continue. "But it was worth it, right?" she asked eagerly. "I mean, you were on a quest to free the Holy Land. Honors greater than any other awaited you. I can scarcely imagine." No, and he wanted to keep it that way. What is the holy city like? Is it true that from the moment you step inside those city gates, you breathe in only holiness? What does holiness smell like? Bernard laughed. He loved her innocence, for nothing could have cut so cleanly through the choking miasma of his thoughts. It smelled of strange spices, camel dung and the sweat of 1,000 men who were not used to the baking heat. The sun cooked the very city stones as if by roasting the place it might purify it somehow. 1,000 years ago the Saviour might have walked those streets, but now it is no holier than any other city. There are men and women, sinners and saints, and everyone in between. Oh! Such a small sound of disappointment, yet it cut him all the same. Perhaps he should have told her a cheerful tale, something that might make her laugh, instead of burdening her with the true nature of the world. For the more he spoke to her, the more he became certain that she was no maid. No, this was Baron Orson's daughter, the virtuous maiden who lived in the tower, and the woman his father had ordered him to kill. But his father was far away, and she was so close he could see her shining eyes in the firelight. That was encouragement enough to go on. But it was still the strangest city I have ever seen, he continued. I have never seen a city so in love with onions. Every tower had an onion for a roof, some beaten out of copper, while others appeared to be gold. And if this was not enough, they'd cut onion-shaped windows in their buildings too. The marketplace was full of strange spices and wonders you could scarcely imagine. But even in that far-off place the onion is king. Ursula laughed. It was such a lovely sound, deeper and throatier than the titters and giggles of court ladies. Lovely enough to make him want to hear it again. They also had the most enormous baths. Instead of the tubs that we use here, they have entire buildings devoted to their tiled pools. And they are not just for noblemen either. Any man may bathe there. And women. On more than one occasion I witnessed a strange procession. A large group of guards and women would head to a particular bathhouse near the city gates. It was only when I asked later that I discovered one of the women was a princess, and the rest her entourage. She did not share the bathhouse, for it was closed for her use alone. On another day I paid the place a visit, and I saw why the princess favored it, for it had a bathtub the size of this room. Ursula sighed. It sounds truly amazing. You are a lucky man to have traveled so much. I have never left this valley. My father had plans to send me away, to marry some nobleman's son I'd never met. Now I will probably never leave. Definitely Orson's daughter. Bernard hoped she never learned that he was Vauquelin's son. 21. After listening to so many stories of far-off lands last night, morning found Ursula surprisingly cheerful. She decided to spend the morning bringing supplies from the cellars to the kitchens, where they would be easier to access when she needed them. As she worked, she found things she hadn't noticed before. Someone had hidden a sack of chestnuts between the wine barrels, which she gleefully lugged to the kitchen. There was flour too, and whole sacks of oats. It was almost enough to make her consider waking the villagers from hibernation. But she resisted the urge, for this food was all they had to last them through the whole winter. It seemed like a lot, but she honestly did not know how much they would need. Not to mention some of it belonged to King Seward, who would come to collect it in the spring. So she limited her takings to a sack here, a cask there, and a few big stone jars of whatever took her fancy. She packed some salt pork and mushrooms in her basket to take upstairs for dinner, debating whether she should take some turnips and carrots up as well. In the end she left them on the table, for they were heavy, and she'd rather not carry them all the way up, only to have to drag them all the way down again. With a basket in one hand and a bucket of water in the other, she ascended the tower, greeting the soldier with a smile. They would need more wood, she noticed as she set the basket down. Better to get it now than later, for the heavy clouds promised snow in the afternoon, and she wished to be inside when that storm hit. In the end she made several trips, ignoring the ache in her arms, for snowstorms this early in the season could last several days, and it was better to have too much than too little. She was exhausted by the time she returned to the kitchen, but he wanted the turnips after all, and another jug of wine to season the stew. But when she returned to the kitchen, she couldn't find the turnips anywhere, or the carrots. She checked on the table, thinking they had simply rolled off, but no. If it was something smaller, she might suspect rats, but it would have to be an enormous rat indeed to carry away a whole turnip. Her thief might have been a cow or goat, had there been a single one left in the valley, but there were no hoof prints on the floor either. She'd heard stories of vengeful ghosts who stole or moved things, but she'd never seen one before. Of course, she'd never seen an army slaughter her household before either, so there could be countless such ghosts in the castle. Perhaps she should head to the church and light a candle for their souls. Lots of candles, for lots of souls, for who knew if anyone had given them the proper death rites, or even a decent burial. She took a shuttered lantern and a box of candles with her, holding her cloak closed with one gloved hand against the rising gale. By the time this storm had blown itself out, the pass would be closed for the winter, if it wasn't already. The church was chilly, for the cold had seeped into the stone walls without anyone to warm it. The candles had all gone out, and Ursula doubted Father Jacques would wake from hibernation any time before spring. Nevertheless, she slid her fingers over the frozen holy water font, until she had enough moisture on her fingers to make the sign of the cross as she genuflected. The statue of Our Lady stood where it always had, carved from the same limestone as the cave that formed the church walls and ceiling. The ledge before it was a river of melted wax, waiting for her offering. With shaking hands, Ursula lit the candles one by one. For Giddy, for Eudes, for Father, for Geoffrey. For the servants who'd kept her warm on cold nights, served her food, kept the home fires burning. For the guardsmen, including Durwood, who had fought and died to defend the castle. For everyone she had lost, whose blood was on her hands, because her marriage alliance had not been concluded sooner. She even lit a candle for her mother, who would probably be waiting in heaven to greet her murdered family, but Ursula prayed anyway, in the hope that her words might make it so. When she had said all she meant to say, Ursula headed out the side entrance through the churchyard, so that she might visit her mother's grave. The sheltered graveyard was not as open to the elements as the castle courtyards, so there was no snow on the ground to conceal the scar across the earth. Where there used to be a path through the gravestones and crypts, now there was an enormous mound of raw earth, topped by a stone cross that had once graced her family's crypt. Vauquelin hadn't needed to make it any plainer. This was where the remains of her family lay, along with those who had served them until death. Thrown into a mass grave, hastily covered over by men who had only cared enough to put a cross over them to mark the site. A black hole opened up in Ursula's chest where her heart should be, as she wept for everything Vauquelin had stolen from her and her people. 22. The wind started to whistle and moan around the tower, throwing snowflakes so hard they sounded like rain. Bernard stoked the fire and stirred the stew, trying not to worry about Ursula. It had been hours since she'd left, promising to return with turnips, but something must have happened to make her forget. Had Goss returned and attacked her? Bernard's blood ran cold at the thought. He'd only known the girl for 2 days and she'd tried to kill him the moment they met, but he would never have wished such a fate upon her. The panic in her eyes as she fought for her life, pushing him down the stairs, he understood all too well. In her place, he would have done the same. In fact, in her place, he probably would have stabbed him last night just to be safe, but she had not done so. Instead, she changed his bandages, brought him food and fuel for the fire, and let him bore her to sleep with stories of his travels. The girl must be an angel. An angel who did not deserve to die or worse at Goss's hands. Bernard considered the door. If he could drag himself to it, he could probably reach up high enough to open it. Then he could try to slide down the stairs to the passage below. Then what though? Lying on the ground, here or on the level below, he was hardly capable of defending himself, let alone her. He could try ordering Goss to leave her alone, but he doubted Goss would listen to a word he said, let alone obey him. Her best chance against Goss would be to defend herself, then run and hide. She might still be hiding, for she'd hidden for a week before returning to the castle last time. A week he'd worry about her, that was for certain. A useless pastime, but what else could he do? So he stirred and stewed and wished with all his might that she would be all right. But when had his wishes ever come true? When the door finally opened, he almost didn't dare to lift his eyes to see who it was. For if it was Goss. She staggered inside, showering snow on the floor as she shivered in her cloak. She fumbled with the clasp but couldn't seem to unfasten it. "Come here, let me help," he said, holding out his arms. Ursula dropped to her knees, dived into his arms, and sobbed. Bernard froze, but only for an instant. Then he did what he'd originally intended, helping her out of her snow-encrusted cloak before she was soaked through by the meltwater. Ursula didn't seem to notice or care. Tentatively, he wrapped his arms around her, hoping to offer a little comfort, if she allowed it. After a while he started to stroke her hair, smoothing the damp curls that had escaped from her braid. Her hands were so cold he could feel the chill through his tunic. How long had she been out in the storm? "What happened?" he asked, his belly churning with dread at what her answer might be. She hiccuped. "I went to the church to light candles for their souls. No need to ask who. Then I walked through the churchyard and saw it. That bastard threw them all into a pit and covered it over, then stole the cross from my mother's grave and shoved it into the sand on top. No respect for the dead. No wonder they want to haunt the castle. They didn't deserve this. None of them did. And it's all my fault." She dissolved into tears once more. Tears of grief and frustration and anger. All things he understood and wished he could protect her from, but it was too late for that. So he did what he could and held her while she cried, wrapping a blanket around her to keep her warm. Her storm of grief ran out before the one outside ended, for Ursula cried herself to sleep in his arms. Not wanting to wake her, instead, he lay down beside her, willing to face her fury when she woke, for it would be worth it to hold her in his arms for a night. He woke when he felt her pull out of his grasp, but he made no move to stop her. "Thank you," she whispered. "I did not mean to burden you with that. I am sorry." "You are most welcome. And you have nothing to be sorry about. The only person to blame for your loss is the man who commanded the army who killed them. Lord Vauquelin. You are innocent." She shook her head. "I could have saved them." He wanted to ask how, but when she didn't elaborate, he decided to stay silent. "Thank you," she said again, then let out a shaky laugh. "What would my father think of me? Spending the night in the bed of a man whose name I do not know." "Bernard. My name is Bernard. And you do know me. I gave you a terrible fright, broke my leg on your stairs, then made you porridge and a stew that you never ate." He managed a rueful smile. "When I put it like that, I'm not sure I'd want to know me either. Oh, even if I do make a reasonable substitute for a handkerchief." She bowed her head. "Thank you, Bernard. But I must go to bed now, and I wish you pleasant dreams." She turned her back, moving into the shadows on the far side of her bed, before she removed her outer dress and slipped between the covers. "May your dreams be sweeter than mine, Ursula," he replied, sighing inwardly. He would dream of her and wake unfulfilled, for the few feet of floor that separated them might as well be an ocean he could never cross. 23. "And a blessed Yule to you too, my dear lady," Bernard roared, downing yet another cup of wine. But that did not stop him from pouring another. Some of it splashed into the pot of chestnuts he'd painstakingly shelled several hours before. He stared at the pot for a moment, as if making a decision of great import, before he upended the wine jug and doused the chestnuts entirely. He added a generous spoon of honey, before hanging the pot over the fire. "My sweet lady, I am about to introduce you to a dish so royal, I am certain you have never eaten it before. It was the king's command that no one else should eat it, for it was his favorite. And as I learned to make it better even than his own cooks, More than once this royal dish rescued me from other, more unpleasant tasks." Ursula giggled. She wasn't sure if Bernard was telling the truth, or telling a fanciful story. "I can't imagine there would be many unpleasant tasks, serving a king on a crusade." Bernard laughed so hard he spat out his wine. "Ah, there you are wrong. The king may be royalty, but he is still a man, with all a man's tastes, appetites and faults. Constant travel is wearying for everyone, be he the king or a lowly page. If the king had only thought to bring women along on his most holy crusade, perhaps it would not have been so bad. But he had formed the idea that women were the source of all temptation, and as such, they had no place on such a holy undertaking." "Well, women certainly have no place in war," she said. Bernard wagged his finger. "Wrong again. War does not work without women. Laundresses, maids, cooks, and camp followers all play their part in keeping an army happy, fed, clothed, and marching to their destination. But the king had other ideas. When he wished to be entertained by a woman, he refused to succumb to temptation. Instead he brought women's gowns. Gowns he made us wear. The young men who served him." Bernard took a gulp from his wine cup, his eyes dark with foreboding. After several cups of wine, he could not tell the difference between a pretty page in a dress, and a real woman. "So when the king ordered you into his bed, you obeyed, or you dishonored your family forever. Curse his name, but the king thought me the prettiest of all." Ursula could not believe what she was hearing. "But there is nothing wrong with asking you to warm his bed. On cold winter nights, I often shared my bed with one or two of my maids. I was glad of the warmth." "If the king summons you to his bed, you would warm it all right," he said grimly. "You would warm it, and him, and any part of him he chose to stick inside you. Anywhere he liked." "You're a man," she protested. "You don't have woman parts." Realization dawned, and with it, horror. "Men do that?" He stirred the pot and said nothing. He didn't need to. But it was a holy crusade. Surely the king. Bernard met her gaze squarely, unflinchingly. Oh, it was holy all right. The king thrusting himself into every hole he could find, all the way to the Holy Land and back. As long as it did not belong to a woman, there was no temptation. No sin. But the boy who cooked his favorite food, he was called to bed less often than the others. Which is why I am such a good cook. He pulled the pot from its hook, and set it on the hearth to cool. Forgive me, lady. I have shocked you. I had intended to carry the secret to my grave, but some things scar a man worse than any broken bones, and the scars show. Pray forget my thoughtless words, and let us speak of happier things. Yuletide memories perhaps, for it is time for cheer and goodwill. But she wasn't listening. You don't belong to that king anymore, Bernard, she said fiercely. Berehaven owes fealty to King Seward, the king across the mountains. He is no defiler of children. Now that my father is gone, I am the power here in Berehaven. And I will ask you to share my bed as a show of faith, no more. I ask for your warmth, and I shall give mine in return, but nothing else. For the night is cold and dark, and you cannot have been comfortable sleeping on the floor. His eyes bored deep into hers, reading her soul. She did not flinch. I will accept your offer, my lady, he said. For I believe we are safe here, while the passes are closed for the winter. I will pledge your safety as readily as you pledge mine. Your honor is safe with me. He patted his leg in its cast. Though I no longer need the box, this will be as good as a sword between us. For a sword might cut you, and I could not have that. He smiled. A king's unwilling lover and a magnificent cook. What other secrets was Bernard hiding? Ursula suspected there was more, but she had the rest of the winter to uncover them.